today's event. Just to remind you, please mute your microphone, turn off your videos so we can focus on the panelists. And during the panel discussion, you can feel free to ask questions in the chat for our speakers, either myself or our moderator in the private chat. And so in terms of the panel today, we'll go into more details, but the panel today is moderated by Moraima Castro-Faix, who is a scientific program manager and analyst at Colombus Technologies. She holds a PhD in the learning sciences from Rutgers, and her research focuses on studying and developing curricula in the sciences at the middle school and high school level. And she recently started a position as a scientific program manager with Colombus Technologies and is part of a team that supports a scholarship for low-income students. And Moraima, you can feel free to add to that introduction. So with that, I'll turn it over to Moraima to talk to us about the panel today.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. In our panel, we're going to learn more about the career paths of our panelists, how they became involved in science policy, and then we'll also discuss issues that are relevant to students underrepresented in science policy, like kind of what Adriana was talking about earlier, and also the different ways that we could support students or provide pathways for them. After our panel discussion, we're going to have breakout rooms so that you can network and ask questions to the panelists. And so I will start introducing the panelists. I see Karen is here already. So Karen Akerlof is an assistant professor in George Mason University. And is Mike and Erin here yet, or? I don't see them yet, but so Erin Heath is the Director of Federal Relations for the American Association for the Advancement in Science, and Mike Holland is the Vice Chancellor for Science Policy and Research Strategies in the University of Pittsburgh. So do we start the panel? Do we give them another minute? Maybe they're having. So maybe thank you everyone for taking time to talk to us. And maybe Karen, we can start with you. Could you please tell us about your science policy career path, your degrees, any interesting experience that you might have?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here today. So when we talk about the people who do this kind of work, sometimes one of the wonky terms used to describe them is boundary spanners. People who cross often between sort of communities of science and policy worlds, but also too sometimes people who are crossing between scientific disciplines as well, trying to work across social sciences and natural or physical sciences. My education was a mix of natural and social science courses, all the way from my bachelor's degree, which happened to be in political science, all the way through my PhD, which is in environmental science and policy. And during that entire period, or subsequently, and during that period, I've worked in academia, journalism, and then also policy settings. So the reason I ended up doing this was actually a little bit, I feel like often because you're boundary spanning, there's no clear paths exactly right to this one career goal, as there might be if you stick in your silo in your lane. My path was also pretty circuitous. So what I thought I was going to be doing when I was in high school and college was that I was either going to be a journalist or a medical doctor. Don't ask me why, those seem very, very different things. But that was those were the options I was considering. So as a result though, I basically was taking math and science courses in order to get into med school, all the way pretty much to the end of college. So I went all the way through organic chemistry. I got a C in organic chemistry, and I must admit I sound like a ghost at that point. But at the same time, I was also working, I worked in the high school and also in college, newspapers. that essentially, that sort of that combination of skills, like having essentially largely, I had a foot in the social sciences, a foot in natural sciences, and then I've done a fair amount of work in journalism, has been really helpful to me in this kinds of stuff that I've done since. In that the kind of problems I'm interested, so I'm now staying at George Mason University as an assistant professor in environmental science and policy. But I'm interested in fundamentally social science questions. So how does science intersect with society in our policy decisions? And it's really helpful to be able to know, like be able to read a natural or physical science paper and realize you don't know everything about it, but at least feel like you can ask the questions to help you know it better and not feel like it's totally Greek. In terms of one of the weirdest experiences I had. So I was really fortunate. So one of the critical points in my path was that I was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow through American Geophysical Union, and I was placed in the Senate for a year. It was a really, really weird year to be on the Hill. So we entered in 2016, my cohort entered in 2016, believing that, that Hillary Clinton was about to take the presidency, and that way we were quickly disabused of that. And that had massive implications, as you all know, for science policy in the federal government, as well as other places as well. And so it was interesting because I was in the Senate, and the member I was working for was on a number of committees that were doing the nominations for people who are going to sit in places like DOE, EPA, et cetera. And so the really weird thing was we were also really worried at this time that the vetting process for nominees by the FBI wasn't going too well. It was not clear what other parts of the government were able to do their jobs. And so one of the things that I ended up doing was essentially oppo research on the extent to which nominees, how would they respond to science policy questions when they were in the agencies? And there was a lot of concern that a lot was hanging on that line. Oppo research was not, even though I've worked in journalism, oppo research was actually not one of the things I had done a lot of. And so I would say that was one of the weirdest experiences I ever had, but also I have immense respect for the staff in Congress as a result. There was a feeling that stuff was hanging on the line of what staff were doing in their offices. And they're all probably not too different in ages than you guys, in their 20s and 30s, with bachelor's or master's degrees, and they're really trying to do their best. The big decisions on the line that have a lot of impact for us all and for science policy generally. Okay, and I see other folks are here, so I'll pass it off to Baton.
Thank you, Erin, for sharing those experiences. Erin, would you like to go next? We're talking about your career path, your experiences, and something that was the most interesting thing to you in your career.
Well, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Good to see all of you. My name is Erin Heath, and sorry, my sound okay?
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm the Director of Federal Relations for AAAS, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and we are the world's largest general scientific society, and we cover all disciplines of science. We are a membership society for scientists and engineers, and we also publish the journal Science in the Science family of journals. And we have a lot of programs that operate at the interface of science and society. And my program is one of them. I'm in the Office of Government Relations. So in terms of how I got my start, the first thing you should know is I do not have a PhD. I actually started as a reporter. That was my first job. I got a bachelor's degree in journalism at the University of Maryland, but I really loved science. I was in a program that involved science and engineering, and I really wanted to write about science. I wanted to write about scientific discoveries initially. I ended up staying in the DC area though, and what do people really care about in DC? Government and politics. So I got a job at a government politics magazine, but I got to write about science policy there, and I ended up getting really interested in that. I got the bug, I guess, and I was speaking to all of these interesting people who were doing interesting things and really supporting issues that I personally really cared about. And so after a few years of and I was at the National Journal, by the way. After a few years at the National Journal, I ended up going back to school and getting a master's in public policy, which we can talk about. And I did that at the London School of Economics. So I got to live abroad and I got to work in Parliament. And then I came back to DC, and my first job after grad school was actually a really great job that combined my skills and my interests, because I worked for a small scientific society of biologists, and I managed their media relations. So I had a lot of journalism experience. I was able to put that to use managing their press room. But I also helped out at the policy office. So I got to get my feet wet doing science policy. And then by a stroke of luck, only about a year later, AAAS posted for a biomedical policy position. And I love biomedical policy. I find it really fascinating. I was especially interested in bioethics issues. So I applied and I got the job. And I really think, we could talk about this further, but I really think my communications experience had a lot to do with why I was considered and hired for the position. And I've been there ever since. I've been there about 15 years, and can work my way up now. I direct the entire federal relations portfolio. So in my office, we have a federal relations division, we have a state relations division, state and local, and then we have a division that focuses on the research and development budget. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of that. But that's my story, and I'm looking forward to talking with you. I'm now going to turn it back to Mike, I guess.
Oh, okay. Hi, I am Mike Holland. I am currently Vice Chancellor for Science Policy and Research Strategy at the University of Pittsburgh. And so let's see, I have a PhD in analytical chemistry from Chapel Hill. I did probably the world's shortest and least productive postdoc at Penn State. And the goal was to get out of lab, which I knew. I also had a very circuitous route through undergrad and grad school, which I'm happy to expound upon at some later date. But I got into, like, my goal was to get into science policy, but I didn't really know what that meant, to be perfectly frank. I had a friend who had been a AAAS Science and Technology Policy fellow when I was in grad school, and a faculty member that I knew had been a fellow. And I was sort of, the common thinking was, well, that's the only way to get into science policy. And so I was actually practicing applying for jobs, because in those days, the AAAS fellowship program was merely competitive as opposed to hyper competitive. And I hadn't applied for anything in ages, so I kind of randomly found 3 jobs that were very different, and I applied for them all. 2 of them, it turns out, were at OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House complex, formerly the Executive Office of the President. And I got called in for one of those jobs for an interview, and I kind of had to ask them which one it was. There was one that sounded like they wanted somebody with my expertise, and then there was the one that was like, I don't exactly know what I'm applying for, but because the exercise was to practice applying for things, I applied. I applied for both of them, and they called me in for the one that I didn't understand anything about. And I was a postdoc at Penn State, so the first thing I did was a card catalog search for Office of Management and Budget. I was extremely lucky in that there was one and only one book that had been published in the past 50 years on OMB. Penn State's library had it. I sprinted to the library to check it out, because that was Thursday and my interview was on Monday. And so I spent the whole weekend reading the book. I got the vocabulary down, interviewed for the job, and I got it. And so that was my entree into science policy. So I was the OMB examiner for the Department of Energy's Office of Science, which is the largest funder of physical sciences. It turns out at OMB, for the number of the R&D accounts, they actually hire PhD scientists. And that was an account that traditionally hired PhD scientists. And then from there, I jumped over to, and that was at the end of the Clinton administration. I jumped over to the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the beginning of the Bush administration to work for Jack Marburger, who was George W. Bush's science advisor. And then I went, and both of those were civil service, or well, actually, OMB was a civil service position. The other one, I was a detailee from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Then I went up to work for the House Science Committee when Sherry Boehlert was chairman, and I was the chairman's designee for the Energy Subcommittee, and that was a woman from Illinois who had Argonne National Lab in her district. So that was one of my labs. So that's why I got that job, to sort of protect her and know her, what her district interests were. And she had also had a lot of constituents who worked for Fermi National Lab, which was another one of the DOE labs that was in my portfolio. So I knew two of the biggest federal sort of installations that were relevant to her, her district. And so I was at that point, I was a Republican staffer, which was a political appointee. There was a change in control of Congress. Because that member from Illinois that I represented her interests was opposed to a new program called ARPA-E, which had become the signature issue for the incoming Democratic chairman. They decided not to keep me because they assumed that my views and her views were identical. And so I was laid off, or not retained because of the change in control of Congress. And then I went back to OMB, back to my old account as the office, overseeing the Office of Science. And then during the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, and there was the Recovery Act of 2009, ARPA-E got funded for the first time. I became the ARPA-E examiner at OMB. The new chairman of the House Science Committee then proceeded with his chief of staff to be absolutely stricken with terror because they had just fired the guy who became the OMB examiner for ARPA-E. They ran to one of my colleagues who was I was a Republican staffer, he was the Democratic staffer, my peer. And they were like, what the hell did we just do? Chris was like, don't worry about it. He does not oppose to ARPA-E. So that was fine. I helped then with the DOE, running a lot of interference in the White House while they were standing up ARPA-E. And then I jumped over to the Department of Energy, where I was the chief of staff for the Undersecretary for Science, which is sort of like an internal science advisor position within the Department of Energy. And then I followed that guy up to NYU after he stepped down and helped start the Center for Urban Science and Progress. I was the chief of staff's executive director for that. And then after he stepped down, I jumped to Penn State, to University of Pittsburgh. And so I work with faculty now on research and development issues. I run a big proposal boot camp. I manage our internal R&D fund. I do all sorts of other stuff, other duties as assigned, which is sort of a standard staffer job description. So that's me.
Thank you everyone for sharing your experiences. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do day to day? Kind of like Mike, you can start first and then popcorn it too.
Yeah, sure. So current job, like I said, I work with faculty on research development. So, and it's on big proposals, I do some stuff with more like the individual investigator scale awards. Mainly, like we have something that's like if a funding agency limits the number of applications that can come in from Pitt, then I manage the down selection of those applications. But sort of day to day, it is a lot, again, because it's essentially proposal coaching, working with faculty, teams of faculty, as they develop those proposals. They're all technical experts, and I work, sort of across campus. So like, there's almost nothing that I'm expert in, or actually, I don't know if I have any expertise anymore in a technical sense. And so I work with faculty on sort of coaching them on how to make their argument, how to assemble all the parts and pieces. And on the big proposals, it's a lot of stuff that they're not accustomed to working on. And the big proposals is more about like, these are strategic investments for the agency. So I kind of help them understand how agencies think about making strategic investments, which is not something that they have thought of before. So that's that's the bulk of things, but others I built or I designed our fee for service policy. I when COVID came up, I was like, from the Pitt research angle, writing all the rules for how we're going to wind down research, $1 billion of research, restart it under a new set of rules. What happened, all the rules for when we transitioned into steady state COVID. So that's the kind of stuff that I do.
Erin, would you like to go next? Thank you.
Sure. Essentially what we do in my office is we connect the policymaking world and the scientific world, which are very, very different worlds. And so what that means in practice is that we work, well, in my department, federal relations, we work closely with Congress as well as the White House and federal agencies. We try to help ensure that policymakers and their staffs have the information they need about science to make decisions, and also try to get science a seat at the decision-making table. We also advocate for the scientific community writ large. And then on the scientist side, we work with scientists and engineers in a lot of different ways to help empower them to participate and engage in the policymaking process at all levels of government. We do that through, for example, we have trainings. We have a weekly newsletter called the Policy Alert. So if you're a member of AAAS, you can opt into our weekly newsletter and learn about the issues of the day. And one of the things I like about that is that there's an action item at the top of every newsletter. So if you want to get involved, there are many different ways to do that. So it's a really nice mix of activities, and it's a lot of fun. It's never, ever boring. I think you asked earlier, and I think I didn't answer, some interesting experiences that I've gotten to have in my job. And I was thinking about that a little bit. I've gotten the privilege of touring a lot of science labs and seeing some really interesting science in action. For example, the James Webb Space Telescope is one I got to see as it was being constructed. Also seen a lot of brain labs because I've done a lot of neuroscience work. I've gotten to meet some interesting, even sometimes famous people, either policymakers or prize-winning scientists. I've gotten to travel to different places, usually universities, but also sometimes places a little more, even more exciting, like Tokyo with Karen. But mainly I get paid to learn things, which is really incredible when you think about it. It's such a privilege. Any given week, I could be learning about human evolution, the COVID lab leak theory, how a biosecurity lab works, arcane rules of the Senate, or implicit bias. It varies, and that's one of the things that makes it super exciting.
Thank you so much. That sounds wonderful. Karen, can you share?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm tenure line assistant professor about 3 years at George Mason University, which is just south of the Beltway. So it's a nice place if you're interested in sort of the policy ecosystem. And not that far from Erin and the folks at AAAS. So generically, because I'm tenure line faculty, I have sort of what a portfolio typically looks like in this job, which is I'm supposed to do research, I'm supposed to do teach, and I'm supposed to do service. Mason is actually an R1 university, so we are specifically interested in doing the research aspect, bringing in funding from, like the stuff that Mike is working on. That's really big deal to our institution. So I've been really lucky in that. So I did, after I had my AAAS, I was on the Hill. I was really lucky to be a visiting scholar, actually working with Erin and Heath and Lise Cloyd and some others at AAAS as a visiting scholar. And I really did actually change kind of the way I was thinking about my research. So I was interested in science communication, especially for policy. And I became very much interested also specifically in contexts like legislatures and other places within the federal ecosystem. So I conduct research on legislative science advice, which is actually, it's a wonky term, but the really cool thing, like Erin was saying, you got to go to Tokyo, is that there's a group called INGSA, International Network for Government Science Advice. There are people talking about these issues, like how can we better use science and policy all over the world. So it's not like, sometimes I think we tend to be in the United States, like this is our problem, right? that we both Americans are exceptional, but then they're also really, really unexceptional sometimes, especially in terms of science. It's sometimes the way we view it. But the reality is it's hard, right? I mean, we've seen science is going exponential growth. Governments are challenged by a whole bunch of different things that are happening in somewhat similar patterns all over the world, and everybody's trying to figure it out. And I think that's really, really exciting. And it's been a really, anyway, that's what one of the areas I'm learning data analytics. Erin talked about learning all the time. I'm learning new methodologies, trying to do this in different ways. I've had a really great time working with the National Park Service last couple of years on how to use social science to develop programs in an area that's sunscreen and its impacts in marine ecosystems, which is an issue that is getting sort of increasing amounts of attention. And then also a project that I'm also working with Erin on and some other folks in Kokia in Alaska is on co-production and federal research programs, thinking about how do we produce research with communities. I will say, so in teaching, the way I do try to bring in some of my experiences to make them accessible to students. So I teach, so teaching is also part of it. And I do try, and in the past, I've been partnering with agencies like National Park Service, or also with offices, congressional offices, and also like county government folks to like have students get to talk with them about what the problems are that they're of interest in, and then write policy memos and deliver them back. And so I try and encourage those connections in my especially in my undergraduate students class, and also to some extent in my graduate student class, so they have those opportunities to see where they might fit into this ecosystem as well. And I'm sorry, I probably took way too long, but thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Know that these responses were wonderful. It sounds like very exciting. You will all have very exciting jobs that, that you just learn something new every day. And that I can see that that's one of the reasons why I personally like science policy a lot also. So I want to move on to talking about certain issues around, becoming involved in science policy, developing a career in science policy. And the first question I have is about skills. So what skills should students interested in science policy develop? And I know that you were talking about communication. So Erin, if you want to start there, and then, or any of you, we could move on to, you can popcorn it to the next person.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, you got it exactly. The first thing I always say is communication skills. And that's written communication, and also just being able to talk to people, being able to talk to strangers is a really, really, and being able to work with people from all walks of life, with all different backgrounds, with all different levels of knowledge of science. So that's something that is really, really important in science policy. And it's the first thing that I would suggest when thinking about what kind of skills and training you would need to work in science policy: communications. Other than that, I would say leadership and problem-solving skills really, really come in handy, and that those can be acquired in all sorts of ways, including community service, for example. And then just a basic understanding of the policy-making process, in part so you know how it works, but also in part so you can figure out if it's something that really interests you. You don't have to know everything. No one ever does. But those are some of the things that I would suggest learning more about if you're interested in working in science policy. And I will kick it over to Mike.
Sure. So I think in my career, and the things that I've seen lots of other people succeed in, the two essential skills that really differentiate people, and that I get sort of asked to do a lot, is writing. So clear, being able to write about complicated technical issues in plain language is an extremely rare skill. And I joke with people all the time. I think half the reason I have a job is because I actually can't do that. And it's not that I'm smarter or more skilled or more whatever than anybody else. It's other than I can write, figure out how to boil complicated things down into brief bullet form that's very clear and very structured. that, like, yeah, that can just make your career, to be perfectly honest. And the other thing is, science is very much like like a team sport, a community sport. Even and universities are very diffuse management, and so knowing how to work within a committee context is essential for getting anything done in a research community, in an academic setting, even within government, where there's enormous coordination issues within agencies and across agencies. And so knowing how to work on a committee effectively. So get yourself into, if you're still in school, get yourself into student government, get yourself elected to student congress or whatever, or get volunteer to work on a committee or something like that. That is the other essential skill, if even above and beyond any technical knowledge. Okay, that's me. And Karen?
Yeah, I echo everything that both Erin and I apologize, dog drinking water behind me. There we go, we're done. So I will say the one thing that I did, sometimes, I think certain types of expertise also, sometimes, or knowing certain areas that are relevant to policy can also be useful. Because one of the things is that you have to be able to have enough knowledge of some area to ask the right questions. You don't have to have it really deep knowledge, but you have to know kind of what the landscape looks like, so that then you can ask the right questions and figure out how to frame these things in ways that are relevant to policy. And so I will say, just from like what I saw, like for example, in the AAAS policy fellows, the ones who got snatched up the fastest were the nuclear scientists, by the way, and they didn't have to get PhDs. The nuclear engineers, they only had to get master's degrees. So, so you can, if you're getting a master's degree right now in nuclear science, you can, yes, definitely go and check out being a policy fellow, because everybody needs to figure out what in the world to do with all these nuclear reactors, a lot of them which are being decommissioned. It's a massive issue, and nobody has the tech, there's very, very light on the technological expertise in the Hill. The other one that, so for me, this was critical. So I was a climate person, and that, which means that I was interested in climate risk, okay? Policy really doesn't care that much about climate risk. Policy cares more about what you actually do about it, right? So, where you see the climate risk stuff coming up is like FEMA. They have to make decisions about insurance. But if we were actually thinking about climate policy, we're thinking about energy. And there's an interesting problem in the science sphere that the climate worlds and the energy worlds actually really don't talk to each other that much. And that's a huge problem. So, because what we really need is we need people who are like engineers. We need the RPE people. We need the people who figure out what the solutions are. And so, so I will say that that was actually like when I ended up working for somebody, to be honest, who knew energy law and had a master's in energy policy. That was a critical skill. That was very, very useful. What I had, which is thinking about climate risks, and yeah, it was not, and nobody when I was there cared anything about coastal risk at that point. So yeah, it was like the CRS report had literally just come out, which basically said sea level rise is a thing and we should worry about it. And that was it. There was like no policy implications. So I will say there are certainly some areas of expertise that are more useful than others. So long story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I have another question for you, Karen, and everyone else can answer. So what do you think institutions should do to help undergraduate students that might be interested in policy? And also, how do we reach students that are underrepresented in science policy? Like, how can we, encourage them to be more involved or learn more or consider science policy as a career?
I try and encourage my the students that I have contact with to go think about internships. I think that the Hill is getting, and you can do those right in both the government as well as on the Hill. So legislative, executive, because I think you can do that to get a sense of whether or not you're actually interested in the space. I think one of the problems is that a lot of these internships classically were not paid, and that obviously has equity implications. I think we're getting better at that. But so that's my first thing is that, and I try to help students figure out what to do. Like, okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to go find like who's your representative. There's a web page that says how to volunteer. You apply this, that kind of stuff. I've also encourage students to check out pathways. The federal government. I think that's another big part of this. Is that there was a report in 2019 by the Belfer Center, which basically said we really need to be thinking about undergraduate pathways to support the S&T workforce. And they basically said, just get them into, don't wait necessarily until they have master's degrees, get them into internships after or while they're in undergraduate. And so places like George Mason University could play a really critical role. And they already, we have a Shar School of Policy and Government, which also does some of this stuff. But encouraging students that these are things that they can do and just helping them connect the dots to get into these spaces.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to provide their insight on this?
Yeah, actually, when I was an undergrad, I actually was a co-op student. I double majored in chemistry and electrical engineering. Well, and not chemical engineering, but chemistry, the basic science, and electrical engineering. But I was a co-op student for a while at Argonne National Lab and then at IBM. And I was able to completely pay for my undergraduate education. I graduated with cash in the, a surplus of cash in the bank. And that gave me immense options that I didn't have to worry about student loans, anything like that. And I had a pretty good fellowship when I started graduate school. And then I kind of wandered around in graduate school. I was basically a professional student, but it gave me a lot of freedom and greater options to do what I wanted to do as opposed to what I felt I needed to do. To deal with student loans. And so one of the things that I really, particularly for first generation students, families who might be more socially or economically disadvantaged, get yourself into a co-op program and work, because then you go to school a semester, you work a semester, you go to school a semester. And it took me longer, but that economic independence that I had coming out of undergraduate degree was unbelievably valuable. And again, when I was an undergraduate, that was when state legislatures were, more dramatically subsidizing undergraduate education. So my first tuition, the books were more expensive than tuition, which I admit is, extremely unusual, but figure out how to get through undergrad with as little debt and as much, and again, that work experience was also extremely valuable. I mean, just from a technical perspective, et cetera, extremely valuable. Because it was, I was working as an electrical engineer and I was working as a chemist and things like that. So that's probably the most important advice I could give.
I just have something brief and pretty specific to add. If you're an institution, one way that you can support your students to learn more about science policy is sponsor them to come to our case workshop. That's something that my office does. That stands for Catalyzing Advocacy in Science and Engineering, and it's an annual science policy boot camp tailored to students. It's only for students, and institution can sponsor their students to come. So anyone who has questions can ask me about that. And for the students, check out not only things like the case workshop, but any scientific society that you are a part of. Often they will have science policy trainings and opportunities to engage and get involved. So I highly recommend checking in with your scientific society and seeing what they offer.
Erin, thank you so much for that. Now we're going to move on to breakout rooms so that the participants can get to ask you questions one-on-one and talk to you. So let me just a minute so we can get them ready.
All right, so I just opened up the breakout room, so you should all see an option to join your room.
Oop. Oh, okay.
We're back.
Thank you, everyone. Are we all back, or are we still?
I think we're all back.
I think we had 17 people when we.
Yeah, we had a, maybe they'll.
Or is there a group that didn't get pulled back in yet?
Maybe they haven't been pulled back in yet.
Okay.
Either way, I think, yeah, maybe we can start kind of, yeah, I think we can kind of close this session. Yeah, Moraima, do you have anything?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for the panelists for coming and answering our questions and like being here to talk to us. And we really appreciate you. I'm very nice to meet you. I'm glad that you came. And also thank you to the participants that, you know, that you asked questions and participated. We're gonna move on now to Gwendolyn. She's going to be talking about doing the workshop. So like the panelists, nice to see you.
Hey, have fun.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye. Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Moraima. Oh my gosh. It's always I'm such a big fan of all of them. It's always nice to hear them talk.
I know. It was nice to talk to them.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we're going to go on. So we're going to go through a kind of an exercise in building elevator pitches. I'm going to share my screen, and the idea, so the game plan here is we're going to go, I'm going to go through, give some tips, kind of how to construct a policy elevator pitch, and then we will break out and do some practice with it. One moment. Here we go. Okay, cool. So essentially where we're at right now is we've talked through a little bit about like how you get to like different pathways in science policy, but there are different ways kind of to practice when you're getting ready to either network, do your job search, those kind of things. And so and then once you I don't know, once you're in a job or like talking to people about policy, you want to be able to express yourself, and if you have ideas in policy in an effective way. So what the idea behind an elevator pitch for policy specifically is, it's kind of similar to an elevator pitch, like if you're doing a job search. It's like, who are you, what are you interested in, all in a very short amount of time. And in this case, it's a concise, easily understandable way to communicate a policy solution. And you can shift them depending on the situation. We're gonna shoot for like 1 to 2 minutes, but I mean, if you're passing someone like in the hallway, maybe you only have like a few seconds to do it. So there are different like amounts of condense that you can do with these, but they all have kind of similar components. So from top to bottom, the components are, I mean, similar to, I mean, looking at this, similar to journalism, it's like the who, what, when, where kind of thing. But if you have, so let's just go through from the beginning to end. So when you're constructing the pitch, you want to be very clear on, first of all, who you are, where you're coming from, and what are your qualifications. So a lot of folks I think we have on the call are scientists, and you have maybe either researched a policy or you have a background in a particular STEM area. And that makes you like qualified to talk about it. It makes you credible. And then when you're going into the talk, you have an idea of what your issue is. You have a policy that you want to propose. So it's important to deliver a strong opening, make it very clear what you want to talk about. Then essentially the what is your project, describing it, and then connecting that to why it's important. What is your goal? What is the value or the benefit? Who needs it? Why Why now? Why is it urgent? And then you get into the how will you make this happen? Kind of breaking down, this could be an opportunity to talk about alternatives that exist. Are there any major barriers? Why is your idea the best, like logistically, to solve a particular policy issue? And then how will you ultimately assess what is a success? What is the benefit? And then when you're closing, you need to think about, okay, what is your ask? Ultimately, depending on your audience, you need to think through, what do you want from the person that you're asking? So if you're talking to a policymaker or like a congressional staffer, you may be asking them literally to put together or support a piece of legislation. But if you're talking to a colleague, that ask may be different. And then also, here are some kind of general things to consider. So the previous slide was kind of the nitty-gritty of it. These are more kind of tips to understand like how to hone it in an effective way. So this is from a great presentation that Luciana Herman put together. And so she has the 9 essential C's. And I won't, read through all of them, but I want to kind of highlight a couple different components. So the first 2 being concise and clear, making sure to remember, we've all been trapped in conversations where someone isn't making these particular components a priority. So keeping it short, avoiding getting bogged down in details, especially if you've thought through or researched a policy issue for a long time. An elevator pitch isn't the time to get into the fine minutiae and details. This is a big picture overview. It serves to get someone interested. There'll be time to talk about details later. Making it compelling, it's important to ground in a vision. What are your goals? Why is what you're proposing important, impactful? This is where you can think about storytelling tools like narrative and emotion. Both are really effective communication methods. This is essentially science communication at its core. For 5 and 6, the conceptual and concrete, I think this is an interesting kind of delicate balance to strike, because you need to outline ideas, but you should be keeping it grounded in those real life impacts. And then the last few, I think, come back to that science communication idea. You need to be acknowledging your audience's values, their goals. Are you trying to convince people who think like you, or is your target audience somehow opposed to your idea? And if that's the case, what are your shared values and goals? And then you go back to science communication tips, like don't speak in jargon. You can tell stories, you can make human connections that resonate with their values. So I'm gonna stop sharing real quick. We're gonna watch a quick elevator pitch that I thought was a useful demonstration. The context is a little bit different. I think this person is sharing her experience after some sort of training opportunity, but I think she does a good job of breaking it down.
Oh no, I think the sound isn't working.
Is it not working?
I was able to unmute.
Was the video sound not working?
Right.
Yeah, the video sound wasn't working. We might have to change a setting on Zoom.
Okay. Let me see. Optimize for video clip. I just might not have done that. Cool. Thanks, Erin.
My mom, who is now retired, was a preschool teacher who worked part-time when I was a kid, while my dad worked full-time as an accountant. Mom was there to drop me off and pick me up from school every day, read to me every night, cook healthy meals for the family, and volunteer at my school whenever she got the chance. As a result of my parents' stable career and incomes, I enjoyed the privilege of a childhood oblivious to the threats of food insecurity and homelessness. My parents' continued investment of time, money, and attentiveness are the reasons that I'm here today. Most of Detroit's children don't have the same opportunities that I did growing up due to simple truths of economic disinvestment. Some parents work 2 to 3 jobs a day with barely enough time to sleep, let alone take their kids to the library. 60% of Detroit children under 5 live in poverty, and only 15% of children are reading proficiently by grade 3. When I point to key reasons for why I'm here today, it all comes back to early childhood education and supports that I received. That's why I chose to spend my summer working on a citywide grade level reading campaign in Detroit. I worked with Brilliant Detroit, a remarkable nonprofit in the city that builds kids' success neighborhoods where families and children are able to build steady, healthy, stable lives. The initiative I worked on is called 313 Reads, and it boasts a systems-level approach to ensure that more children are reading proficiently by grade 3. During my 10-week internship, I worked with Brilliant Detroit and Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan to strengthen 313 Read's collective impact model in 3 ways. First, I interviewed nonprofit directors in Detroit to assess capacity for expansion of early childhood services and possibilities to build stronger referral networks between them. Second, I researched leading practices used by grade-level reading campaigns across the nation and education experts here at U of M to track progress on community-wide literacy goals. Finally, I built an evaluation framework informed by all of the above that would allow nonprofits and community leaders alike to see how well the city was doing at accomplishing all of those goals. I feel empowered every single day by the sincere efforts of my parents to build opportunity for me. The closest intervention to the comprehensive supports that I and others in my position have received is a collective impact model, which is essentially a comprehensive model for collaboration. 313 Reads involves partners from early education providers to pediatricians and food banks. Promising progress of other collective impact grade level reading campaigns gives me the inspiration to continue doing this work in Detroit. After graduation, I certainly will remain connected to the city and find new ways to contribute to the rise of new generations. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So I think she did a good job of distilling down her experience, how it was connected to her. And I think in our particular case, if we are interested in sharing a policy, it would be more proposing an idea rather than explaining like an experience. So for right now, we are gonna do some practice of our own. And we're going to develop our own little elevator pitch to address some sort of gap in science policy training, opportunities, pathways. Let's see, and I think Erin has breakout rooms ready. Let's see, and I think each of them has a prompt associated with it. Are we set to go, Erin?
I'm creating them right now, so just hang tight one sec.
No, that's perfect. Cool. And then Adriana just shared documents that we're going to do some brainstorming in. And then once we get through that, maybe it'll be a little less than a half hour, depending on timing, but we can kind of work through, create a pitch, and then come back together. And if we have time allowing, we can do some feedback.
Great. How many rooms do we need? Do we want one room for all of us since it's a small group?
Yeah, we may even, I think we're probably, not even need to do that then, yeah.
Okay, great. So I just created the groups, so feel free to join.
Sorry, Doris, you were saying something really interesting. You can say it if you can. Yeah, sorry about that. It just ended.
Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Just stating the obvious that for graduate students, I do get feedback that the professors would prefer them to be on the bench and not attending these conferences, which are not getting their research anywhere. And I would say in undergraduate science students under a lot of pressure, of course, heavy workloads. So again, why should they be doing these extra activities?
Yeah, exactly. And we've heard that feedback and kind of pushback from multiple people that there's a concern about the scientific workforce as well. Like if we're pulling scientists from the bench, like who's going to be doing the bench research? Mm-hmm. And so obviously, you know, if you really look at the science workforce, there are more science, like PhD level scientists than there are jobs for PhD level scientists. And so trying to find different career paths that accommodate people that don't necessarily want to go into bench research, that want to do something different. It's a little bit of like a push and pull where, you know, it's almost like PhD students and even undergraduate students have to decide, like, what are we going to do? Like, am I going to be full on science policy or am I going to be full on bench research? So there's definitely a little bit of tension between the two that hopefully more, like you said, Doris and Maya, like more visibility, more accessibility, and more understanding of what science policy is can kind of like alleviate that tension.
If I may give an example, we've had someone get a fellowship and go to government regulatory agencies, then get a very, very nice job at a biotech firm that needs to know about regulatory issues.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I think, you know, science policy, there's so many benefits to learning the interdisciplinary skills of like applying your science into society and into like policy space. So it is really, you know, it's beneficial for the student, but is it beneficial for the institution if they continue to put more of their effort into policy rather than bench research?
Yeah, I think there's also like a tendency for like scientists to kind of underestimate their own like value and power in the policy space, since like there's like, you know, like science can influence policy, but they're also like subject to policy. And so like being aware of that and knowing who to influence and who to talk to, like there are these huge international societies that can really do a lot of, you know, work in terms of like influencing policies that are, you know, helpful for science.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm interested, Maya, as a current graduate student, have you felt this tension? Do you feel that you sometimes have to choose between your research and your extracurricular activities, whether it be policy related or, like you said, the Genetics Society? They have Hill Days. Like, do you find you sometimes feel that tension?
I do kind of. It's just like in terms of, for me, like my advisor is really supportive and, you know, I've like taken extra classes and he's totally fine with it. There are others that are not. But so I'm lucky in that regard. But like, just in terms of like, I think now because I'm trying to finish up my research. And so I'm like, I have, you know, and some of it's very time consuming. And so it's just hard to have the energy for both. Cause it's like, in some ways I'm like, oh yeah, I have to be like full tilt in my research now and actually like finish the requirements for my PhD. Whereas like, you know, doing other things doesn't fulfill that requirement. Cause it's like, I still have to have a published paper to be able to finish.
Yeah, it's really tough. I feel like there are tons of opportunities that in policy that almost help you with some of your scientific, like communication skills, like we were saying, and even writing skills, like writing brief, like what Mike was saying earlier, being able to write brief and concisely. So the skills you learn in policy can definitely translate into your research. And so trying to bring more of that visibility to the importance of those opportunities and how they can benefit you in your research for sure.
Yeah, it's also tricky since, you know, it's like I have to pick conferences smartly. So like there are, you know, scientific conferences that are really interesting to me, but they don't necessarily have a policy like avenue at all. Whereas, you know, like the American Society for Cell Biology is like a much larger society. And so like they do like at their like big scientific conference, they also have like policy and professional development stuff. And so it's like, okay, well, that for me is a more useful one because I can still present my work and, you know, do things that will make my PI happy, but also like do stuff that will benefit me. So it's kind of nice but yeah, there aren't like a ton that have like opportunities for both.
Yeah, that's a tough balance. I think that's a very good point that are like, I think scientific societies they are reflective of the community, but they are slow to change. And I think, definitely seen over the past few years, like upticks in like policy being included. But if you're not a large like scientific society, it's tough. It seems. Yeah. So I was just thinking, Adriana, did you have something to say? Sorry.
No, I was thinking about this because I just saw recently that DOE has internships for undergraduate students. So, I think there are some agencies that are starting to build these things, or maybe they've had them or they're expanded. That's something to look at. No, it's just because I was just looking at the notes in relation to the government relations bullet point here. That we actually, and this is not in a work capacity here, but in our office, we do actually have an internship with the UC DC program for undergrads for 10 weeks, I believe, and they come on at different times during the year from different campuses in the UC system. So that is one way that, they are engaged in, they just started coming back to DC, but, and then we also have invited in the past students to different panels and actually had to organize the briefing maybe about a year ago with trainees to talk to whole staff. So I guess, I think universities maybe are a good way to explore some of this for other folks too.
Yeah, totally agree. That always makes me think too about how so there's like these different kind of phases of expanding pathways. And so where we're at is like, there's kind of making the opportunities available. So there are like internships and workshops and things like that. Then there's on the back end of that is like expanding visibility for the people that we'd want to like bring into them. And then on the other side, like down like the line is making sure that there are like job opportunities available for them. And so if there are like, as we kind of touched on this, but like if there's any sort of stigma associated with like, if science policy job openings are only listing like openings for PhD people who have doctorates, then people who are trying to get into the field won't be able to like, make their way into it. And where it stands now, what we found so far kind of is that there just the overwhelming amount of opportunities are for people with doctorates. So yes. It's tough to walk. It's a line to walk.
Mm-hmm. I have to commend Maya for picking and choosing, for thinking of a meeting as how is this going to advance me personally in my goals? Not just working toward my advisor's goals or whatever, and that's a good way for advancing yourself. Also at these meetings, networking. And I think networking is going to come back. We're going to have, I hope, actual people. Absolutely. Because it's those informal conversations. And I will have to say, when I was in grad school, I was really dumb. And even as a young professor, I would go to the meetings and then, attend the feedback after the lectures. And I would walk down the street and there would be people sitting in the bars on the sidewalks, scratching formulas on pieces of paper. And it took me a long time to figure out that that's where the important stuff was going on. So a word to the wise, going to the good meetings and making the most of them.
Truly a word to the wise. Yeah, that's cool. Let's see. I'm thinking game planning with the elevator pitch. I'm wondering if it might be more helpful for us to kind of talk through if we can kind of talk through the rest of the structure, and also I'm wondering if ultimately it might just be more helpful if you guys have any questions about it, if we could kind of talk through how, make it more tailored to what you might be. Doris, you were saying you have like involvement in like, is it public affairs? What was the
it's called government relations but yes, we people getting together, and very often the main thing we need to know is who's your rep, because we're going to go to their office. And I must say, one thing that was in the elevator speech, I think yours, that was so good was the ask. It's so important to have the ask, and I there's what was it? Barney Frank, went to Barney Frank's office. And the thing is, you get these appointments, you know, at the last minute, at the spur of the moment. You've got your request in, you keep checking, calling the, you know, the people in the office, getting to know them. And then suddenly he's got a moment and you go in. This is like relatively early on, but you know, it's Barney Frank and we go in, hello, what do you want? I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Doris Lewis, American Chemical Society, where, you know, we want to, if Isabella, he says, what do you want? And making bare the fact that I had gone in without an ask, all right, just to share my embarrassing moments here, that was one of them. It's not always like that. You know, as I said, Kennedy was just very welcoming and we had wonderful conversations, but one learns from these experiences, you know, and go into the office. And on the plus, what you will find is I was on the American Chemical Society committee that did go to the Hill and had the experience of we were shepherded in by an ACS person saying, this is Susie Q, and this person is a member of the board of directors of the American Chemical Society. And the person says, come in, Susie, and you can bring your friends. Because when you're the constituent, you're the important person. And when you're in the office, you'll find these are very young people. They're just your age, you know. So who's important? And particularly to someone who's maybe a graduate student is just usually, you know, accustomed to being, you know, beaten and suppressed regularly. It's a good experience. And again, can be life-changing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, you're totally right. I think it's this sort of thing, the communication component of it and understanding your audience and what they're looking for. So in this case, the ask is the thing. And that's where when you're constructing something like this, you can kind of work backwards a little bit from and think about, yeah, what is the ask, and then and then add from there if needed / wanted. But yeah, let's see. Is there anything else we want to hit?
I was just gonna ask, so to bring it back to the workshop today, and all of these ideas are great, and sort of, you know, how do you kind of see, you know, pitching for training for undergraduates? You know, do you have ideas sort of how you would frame a pitch around this, even though we don't have to go through all the structure, but just curious if anybody has a answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I can give an example just to like spur some thoughts and discussion. So I think I may have I think Nicole was in the group when I had originally said this, but during my master's in science policy, we had to come up with a policy proposal, and we decided to try to do this to expand science policy opportunities. And what we ended up doing was trying to expand the research experiences for undergraduate programs, so the REU program through the National Science Foundation, to include science policy as like a discipline where people can host these science policy programs over the summer. And what was really helpful for us was the foundation and the structure of the program was already done. So NSF has already done this for like biology, for math, for chemistry, for all the scientific disciplines. And so really adding science policy into that would have been a very small ask, and it's already like thought out and set up and has shown success in the years before. Like the REU program's been very successful. And so we really were kind of piggybacking on that to expand science policy opportunities. And so I think when we're thinking about how do we create more visibility for science policy, how do we get undergraduates involved, we really should be looking at programs that are already in place, that have already shown success, and just expanding them to include science policy. And that would not only highlight the need for more of these programs, but it would already set us up for success because it's already been proven to be successful. So like, why reinvent the wheel when we can just build on something that's already been done? And so that's kind of what I learned from that whole experience, and something that I hope we can continue to build on and think about as we're looking to expand these opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. Like, for example, all universities have summer research programs. So instead of being a summer research program in a lab, it can be a summer research in a policy, or a summer experience in a policy office, or in a, sort of like leverage, knowing that universities have offices that take care of the policies that are of the university. You could just, instead of having a student in a lab, have them in a policy office for 10 weeks, and they get to see how it works, right? Like, just using what's in place. So I hear you that you're saying just using what's in place to set up opportunities, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of reminds me too of, I mean, what Doris was bringing up with the folks you mentioned, as far as like making sure we know what other initiatives are out there and are working well. And it's tough because it's such a diffuse space. Like there are probably other people doing effective things, but if we don't know about them, then yeah, how do we take those ideas and make them better?
Yeah, similar thing would be like there are a bunch of like post-baccalaureate programs. Like I did one at the NIH, and mine was like giving very basic bench science, but the NIH has a ton of policy fields as well. They also have like bioethics as a whole component. And so like something that could be done, or just like, also postdoctoral experiences would be really helpful. Like for, if someone doesn't want to do a traditional postdoc, if you could have one that's more science policy focused, would be really helpful.
I think one thing we may do is sponsor panels at American Chemical Society meetings, either regional or national, and actually Heidi did this at the San Diego meeting just recently. And then I'm going to ask her, like, we're going to have lunch soon, ask her, like, who showed up, and what were they doing? But that's a good way to initiate networking, is get something started through a society meeting.
Yeah, I was going to bring up one other thing that I learned recently. So looking at us from the funding agency perspective, because NSF actually recently added kind of, I think, both policy and workforce to their broader impact criteria. So I'm going to just share this. So I think there are some efforts for this to happen from agencies as well. And hopefully we'll see this. And I always bring this up that obviously not for undergrads, but I've seen a couple of schools that now actually, or maybe it's dependent on the PI, but basically the students will have a policy chapter in their dissertation in addition to, what they would defend with, essentially. And that is a great way to, help them to think about the societal impacts of what they're researching. I think I've only seen that at a couple of schools, but again, it may be dependent on the PI and all of that, but that's another thing that would be interesting.
That's how my dissertation was. I had to write like a chapter on like how my work was impactful to educational policy. So yeah.
That's cool.
Oh.
Excellent. Well, maybe we start wrapping it up. I think, yeah, thank you so much for the discussion. It is so helpful to hear from, I think people who are in it, who are,
Yes.
Appreciate it. Adriana, do you have any final kind of remarks to add?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this has been interesting. We, as I mentioned in the start, our lab is very new and we're trying to build some initiatives. So we appreciate everybody's participation today. Really appreciated the panel's input as well. I'll have to go back and watch some of that because I think it's very insightful. And again, where they all have ended up in their different careers that they have. So, and hopefully we'll plan more events in the future. So I think folks who signed up for this one, we'll keep you on the list. And we'll have more things in the future, but I don't know. Anyone else want to give any closing?
Yeah, so Erin just shared the survey for the event. So if you could take it, that will help us in the future. And also if you would like us to keep it, you would like to keep in contact with us, you can share it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And Doris, it was really nice to meet you. Yeah, we were together in the breakout room, so we had the opportunity to chat a little.
From the beginning. It was Maya and me, you know. Cool. Great. We'll have a great rest of the Sunday, and yeah, a good week to come.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye all.